since December now, so managed to keep up regular showing on a Sunday night. Where I've been talking to activists from all over the country, some fantastic people. And last week we were in Birmingham, which was a really good show, and we talked to a group of activists that were doing all sorts of things, from kind of community organising to trade union stuff. And we talked a lot about the radical history of Birmingham. So if you get a chance, certainly have a look at that program. It's really interesting. I showed my complete ignorance of West Midlands radical history, and I made a bit of a boo-boo when I talked about got the Black Country and yams and things and Brummies mixed up. And I was shamed by them. Anyway, we sorted it out now, and we're on track. So this week we are back home in a way. I'm not on the road this week. Got back in Durham here, and we've got oh, sorry. I just to say I need to tell you what I'm drinking, because that's important. So I've got a pint of Wylam Brown Ale. It's actually called Eating the Toon Brown, which is clever. But it's a really nice pint of brown ale. So I've gone very local today, and Wylam are a really fantastic local brewery with a good politics and so on. And we've got two kind of stalwarts, really. I don't know if stalwarts is that a nice name? I suppose it's what you call a really seasoned midfielder in a football team. But two very experienced socialist feminists and stars, I think, of the socialist movement tonight. And I'm really pleased to have them. So first we have Alison McGarry, and she is chair of Islington North CLP. I think she has a bit of a main line into a certain Jeremy Corbyn and speaks to him regularly. We won't ask you for any secrets tonight, Alison. Keep it professional. But she's had a lifetime really in the trade union movement, particularly in trade union education and in international solidarity movements around the world. And actually, me and Alison both worked at the TUC at the same time, although I was right up in Newcastle and she was down in London. But I did see her now and again, and we kind of shared the same workplace for a while, didn't we, Alison?
Yeah, we did. Yes, we did.
That was interesting.
Yeah, I thought, yes, we did. Sadly, we didn't know each other. Otherwise, it would have been good to find, a workplace ally. Although there were many of them too, but great organisation. But I miss the action. I miss the activities on the ground. Yeah, and I've got tea.
You're drinking tea tonight. Actually, I was really lucky as well at the TUC that I worked on an organising project. So I was on the TUC Organising Academy, and working with Liz Blackshaw. I don't you remember Liz, don't you? Yeah. And I think she's working in one of the global trade union federation still now, I think, isn't she?
I know Liz very, very well. And I was lucky to join the TUC the first year of the Organising Academy and got to teach on it for 6 years or so, and met a lot of organisers. Now it's really great to see how many of them are still doing good work in the movement and good solid work. Of course, a number are MPs like Rachel Maskell, and a few others who've become MPs. But Liz is excellent organiser, excellent trainer. And she is the head of global campaigns now at the International Transport Workers Federation.
Yeah.
But still firmly rooted in the day-to-day work.
Yeah.
So big up Liz Blackshaw.
She's a brilliant woman and taught me so much. And I actually keep in touch with a hell of a lot of the academy group that I was in as well, that year group, and they're all doing fantastic stuff. Well. So it's really, really good to have you on, Alison, and be really good to hear more about your international trade union stuff a bit later as well. And then we have Pamela Fitzpatrick, who was parliamentary candidate for Harrow East in the last election. She's also a councillor. She spent an awful lot of time working in the voluntary sector. That's right, isn't it? And right. And you now work in the law centre in Harrow. Yeah. And on Twitter, you said, I like this. You said, you're tired of injustice. And aren't we all? I think that's really nice. But and what are you drinking tonight, Pam?
I'm drinking a glass of white wine. It's quite a big glass, but it's not quite a pint. Sauvignon Blanc. It's very nice. So It's nice at the end of the day to have a glass of wine.
Good stuff. And how's your day been? Have you? I mean, it's obviously Mother's Day today. So have you been? Do you bother with that at all? Or?
Yeah, we do normally actually, and I found it quite emotional today, really, because one of my sons still lives at home, but the other one doesn't. So I wasn't able to see my other son. So it's kind of a bit sad because at the start of the pandemic last year, it was just before Mother's Day. So it feels like anniversaries. We've gone through a whole year and it's just a reminder. But it's been nice as well. I brought a cup of tea and chocolates and various things for my son this morning. So that was nice. And we've had a nice day together. So.
Yeah, I had the joy of being with my two sons last night and with my partner because we've all had the injections. So we could be in a space together. I drank a lot of organic Prosecco. I know it sounds terribly bourgeois, but it's very good for my mature stomach, I find. And I had a great time catching up with my sons. One of whom's a trade union organiser, so they've been brought up proper, and I've great fun with them.
Yeah. And is there like feminist possibilities to Mother's Day, or should we just stick with International Women's Day?
I think so.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I wanted to get on fairly quickly onto the kind of onto the main kind of discussion points this week. Obviously, it's been a really sad week in a lot of ways, hasn't it? The murder of Sarah Everard has obviously been, a focal point with it. But obviously, there's also been this kind of outpouring, really, of women telling their stories. I've been looking on Twitter this week and reading some of the stuff around, stories of violence and sexual harassment. And so, Pam, what's your reaction been to that? I mean, obviously, it's tragic, but also has it been empowering as well?
I mean, I firstly was really upset by it, and in part because we had an incident about a year ago where two women near to Harrow were murdered in a park, and the police who were guarding their bodies were accused of taking selfies with the bodies and distributing them on a WhatsApp group with other police officers. And I made a complaint at the time. And one of the women was a Labour Party member and was a Corbyn supporter, and she'd helped in the general election in Harrow East. So it felt really personal. And the police at the time assured me this was a one-off, completely nothing like this could happen. And so this happening this week, obviously it's an allegation. Again, we don't know for sure, but just it really hit me, it really affected me. And then looking at the outpouring from women, you can really feel the pain and the anger. And I was thinking about it because we've all got a story to tell, all of us, even if you haven't. I mean, I think there was a report out last week that said that 97% of women in the UK have experienced sexual harassment. It's an incredible number. But when you think back, we all know that feeling of going home, holding the keys, texting your friends to make sure they've got home safely. If they don't answer, what's gone on. All of us do that. Even as we get older, we still have that fear. And I had an incident about a year ago where my nephew, young 20-year-old, I think at the time, was walking home early evening and a man stopped her in the street. It was quite deserted and he tried to attack her. And she ran and he ran after her. And it was quite a deserted road. And luckily a bus came along and the bus driver saw her running and he stopped for her and let her on the bus and he took her to safety. And I can't tell you how, proud, pleased we were about that. And I tweeted about that last year and it got about 10,000 retweets and people telling similar stories. And that's what's so sad. We all know what it's like. And that sort of anger. So in terms of the positivity, and also this coming at the end of this week, it's been a terrible week for women. You know, we've had International Women's Day on Monday. We get the Laura Pidcock incident on Tuesday. We get the terrible murder, but there's been a whole load of other things that have been dreadful for women. The pay increase for nurses, the fining of the nurse who was protesting, and then finally yesterday, when all these women subjected to violence by the police at a peaceful demonstration. So it's hard to think of the positives, but the positives are, I don't know how many of us have felt so frustrated on Zoom after Zoom or Teams meeting the last year and feeling there's so much to be angry about and what we want to do, and you can't do anything, you're stuck at home. And what yesterday showed is the power of that physical protest and people coming together. Because the Labour Party, if you think last week, Keir Starmer was saying what we needed as a response to alleged police brutality was more bobbies on the beat. Well, that really didn't fill me with confidence. And also we've got this bill going ahead tomorrow that in Parliament that has implications about protest, and apparently Labour were going to abstain, can't imagine why, but they were. But there's been a U-turn on that. So that just shows the power of people coming together, and that was in peaceful protest. So there is a positive. It's hard to see it sometimes, but there is a real positive, I think.
Well, how do you feel about that, Alison?
I mean, for me, it brought back, and it still does, sort of visceral, really memories. In my teens, we had domestic violence in the family. And I was attacked about 10 years ago in the street. And with the latter, we called the police. A white police van appeared at 9 o'clock at night. It was a summer's night with 5 of them. Okay, guys. But they then proceeded to tell me and my partner that their wives and girlfriends don't go out after 9 o'clock at night. So effectively, I got off the tube. It was almost like, oh yeah, but I can give you a description. And they just were not interested then. And for me, that matched with my experience when we'd call them a lot when I was a teenager. Again, no, it's not a domestic, it's not my issue. And really, the responsibility is on you almost as a woman to do something about this with your behaviours. Now, it's probably not conscious, but it really is, it's gut-wrenching, actually. And that's what I felt this week. And I do a lot of work internationally and nationally with women in trade unions. And a lot of that work is around domestic violence and violence in the workplace. And again, it's one thing, there's a lot, you can talk about the facts and figures, the cases of where women have run campaigns and been successful in the workplace, good work unions have done, in collective bargaining negotiation about supporting women who've had, violence in the workplace or at home, getting them paid leave. But it's still, this week really brought home again to me, as I say, physically embodied the murder of this woman. I mean, but what it also then gives me hope. Because, as Pam said, the response of people coming out into the parks. My sister-in-law and a number of comrades I know took part in those demonstration. Or it's meant to be a vigil, wasn't it? It was actually demonstration and then a police attack. Let's be frank. And of course, we've all got our individual stories. Most women have probably got one story or another about how violence or both physical or mental or whatever has affected their lives. But again, the coming together of the collective and taking action is just so powerful. And it begins to start the sharing of the stories. And again, just to quickly go back, and I'm going to finish on this and move on from my teens. I was 14 and I was in the Young Communist League, left when I was 16 and joined the YS, but that's another story. And I never talked about home conditions. I never talked about what was happening to me at home. And eventually one day I did, and it was predominantly male comrades, of course, and one of the brothers said to me, well, we'll just come round and show him what's what. And I'm going, oh, no. And I understand that response, but of course that response would have actually, you know, added fuel to the fire. It wouldn't have helped at all. But to see sisters taking action, sisters sharing their stories, and more, in some ways, even more, yes, there's that collective feeling, but at raising the question, because it puts in their minds and in the people who are watching that demonstration, what is happening? Why is it happening? The police are taking action against women like this. Where's the government? And it gives us an opportunity to intervene, to have those discussions, both about the personal, but to collectivise it into the, okay, what is the Labour Party's position? What are socialists and trade unionists doing? How can we combine and organise and support and seriously campaign? And of course, we know this act, which very relieved that Labour are saying no to it, not supporting, especially after the disgraceful support of the Spy Cops bill. But this, and I was only, and I'm not a lawyer, so I didn't read it in detail, but again, my sister-in-law said to me, it's really pernicious because it's not just about stopping demonstrations, taking away our democratic rights. And of course, Priti Patel, what does she call the campaigners, the young Extinction Rebellion of criminals? Black Lives Matter, they shouldn't be out on the streets either. But my sister-in-law pointed out it's also about shutting people up. Apparently there's a clause in this new bill they want to put out which says that you can't demonstrate, you know, if you affect your neighbours, Whitehall, your employer, but also you've got to be quiet. And if you raise your voice, that's a form of attack. I mean, it was shocking. And of course, what it makes me think, we need to raise our voices higher then, don't we, on any demonstration, on any action that we take. And I'll just finish, because actually that question about keeping silent with this, the police can move against you if this act goes through, if you're not silent. We've, in our constituency, a number of times, we've had workers from Sage in North London, which is a care home where migrant workers are organising for basic union recognition. Predominantly women, many different countries of the globe, and they use songs and flags and paintings and music, really exciting campaigning and engagement and drawing attention to the issue. Now, theoretically, of course, which of course we'd ignore it, but under that legislation, if it was passed, they'd be moved on much more quickly than probably they would be moved on originally. So, yeah, so it's, again, it's just those little nuances about an act that you would know, maybe Pam from the Law Centre, but I hadn't read up or thought through about giving the state, giving the police carte blanche to stop you undertaking really any solidarity action or raising your voice.
Yeah, I mean, there was a whole stuff about, you know, like the obviously the policing of the vigil last night. I wondered about, you know, how that kind of, I mean, that's obviously had an effect on the Labour Party's position, but also it kind of, I think Laura Pidcock made this point. It shows the direction of travel, doesn't it? Of how this government are going to be policing demonstrations, and it was horrific to watch, wasn't it, last night? I mean, Alison, what did you think when you saw it?
I couldn't quite believe it at first, because here were women with candles and flowers, and I mean the princess had been along, hadn't she, in solidarity. And it was, and again, it's that visceral thing, because I know you understand it objectively. And we know, going back to the miners' strike and before, we expect the police to behave badly, times when they're in a difficult situation. And I don't think it's always thought through their responses or strategically planned or directed by whoever the commanders in chief are. But looking at that yesterday, I mean, there was absolute no reason. I couldn't see any objective reason. And where was the commander or the person in charge of it? What were they telling those police on the ground? Because throwing women to the ground, trampling. So, of course, the very force that we are meant to look to, according to Labour, and we want more police on the ground, is the very force that's actually harassing these women and stopping them both mourning and celebrating women's rights to organise and to say, no, this shouldn't be happening. And again, I just want to come in quickly, one more thing. It also made me think, and again, because I've been on, like the comrades here, on loads of picket lines and whatever. And I remember when I was about 22, some steel, I am aged, 22, some steel workers came in Birmingham and stayed with us from Sheffield. And we went on the picket line with them because we were housing them for solidarity reasons. And I remember getting absolutely kicked and bullied and punched by the police and thinking, initially, well, I'm a woman, how can they do this to me? Because I expect, and a lot of black comrades were with us from the PMP, and they were all getting thumped. And I thought, oh. And what was interesting was the gendered violence. They kicked me in my vagina. They punched me on the breasts. There was no tolerance, or it was just a different form of physical attack on that demonstration, on that picket line, and that stayed with me again. And I thought what was interesting was last night, yes, they were throwing women to the ground, but I also think their tactics have got sharper, their physical tactics. I think maybe even a decade ago, and I'm sure comrades will probably have other experiences that might prove me wrong, but I'd have said a decade ago, if the police had behaved that way around a women's demonstration or a women's vigil, and I keep calling it demonstration, sorry, it was a vigil, around a woman's vigil, I would have expected more publicity and anger and questioning at the very least about that. But again, how much also it's down to COVID and the lack of labour movement activity, sort of like an anaesthetic. You know, you become detached, I think, from the physical struggle and the physical reality. And so that also I found interesting my response to it last night. I hadn't really thought that through.
Yeah, that is really interesting.
Yes. But this government will have no bans. I mean, we know that.
Yeah. Pam, did you, when you watched it, do you feel like this is in a way the government, the police, and maybe the commissioner, taking the opportunity as well to kind of clamp down on on protest as well as obviously, I mean, the absolute kind of insult of doing this in a vigil for a woman that had been killed by a policeman.
Yes, anybody with any sense would say you want this to be really low key, you want to ensure that it's a peaceful thing, so for PR for the police. And the fact they didn't do that, I don't think is by accident, I think it was deliberate. And so therefore, why would that be? And if you think about what's happening, it's both kind of worrying, but also gives me pause for optimism, because what you've got is a government who know they've gone too far, because there's almost like, why we have a fairly decent social security system is to keep people down, to give them enough crumbs so that they don't rise up and rebel. And they've taken everything away. And COVID has so exposed the levels of poverty, inequality, and everything else that there's a real risk that people are so angry that they are going to take to the streets. Once the lockdown is over, there's going to be rebellion. And so they're thinking, well, we need this legislation, which is going to curb it, which is going to allow us to imprison people for things whereby in the past they would have just got a fine. And where they do get fines, it'll be hiked up to £10,000. So they're gearing up a bit in the way like they did for the miners' strike to take people on. So they're preparing for it. So they've got the legislation. But in a way, isn't that a good thing that people are waking up to this and maybe taking some action? So I was shocked, I was surprised, because I really thought the police would have a soft touch to this because of the sensitivities. And the fact they didn't, and they looked as though they were deliberately just pulling out women who were doing nothing. The women were just standing and they pulled them out, and there was no need for that. And when you compare it to other protests that have gone on, where there has been a light touch. So I don't know, it's very odd, but I think it's got, I think it was a wrong move by the government, and it will just up the ante on all sides, won't it? Because people are not going to put up with this. So it's raised the bar a bit. So we'll see. I found it very upsetting. I really found it upsetting watching it. There's a culmination of a whole week of things related to women that you just think this is just appalling.
Yeah. If we go back a few days before that happened, that's obviously been the focus of the last 24 hours or so. But before that, I don't know if you saw some of the initial reactions on Twitter, and there was, I think, a hashtag called "Not All Men," and that was, incredibly kind of crass and stupid, I think, but also an attempt to kind of almost kind of take away fear, and to kind of normalize the situation, and sort of emphasizing how rare the incidents were. So there was an awful lot of talk about that. But I mean, you work in a law centre, okay? So you represent, women that have been subject to male violence and so on. So you have a sense, and obviously there's figures as well, but you have a sense of how common it is. And is that right? I mean, it is a very common occurrence, right?
It's really common. And when you see the stats, even when I read out the stat of 90%, 7%, it's shocking. It's kind of meaningless. It's just a stat. But when you see what these women go through, and there's different levels of domestic violence, and the Law Centre deals with a whole range of them. But I suppose the absolute worst are the women who are trafficked. So we assist a load of women who are trafficked. And the reason we find them is because they've escaped from their trafficker. And the normal situation is the woman has been brought to the UK under false pretenses for a job or something. Her passport's taken away. She's forced into prostitution. And at some point she'll get pregnant. And they would normally take her for an abortion if she's pregnant, a forced abortion. But often the women hide their pregnancy until it's at a point that they can't have an abortion. So what the traffickers do then is to keep the women until near to the birth, and then they take them to have the baby delivered and then sold. And it's at that point often that the women escape and find their way to get help and advice. So the Law Centre, for example, often it's women who are not British citizens. So they're worried about they'll be, sent to the police, and the police in their home country are corrupt, violent, whatever. And they're also worried about their family at home will be targeted for violence, or even that they can't return home because of the shame of what's happened to them. And so the Law Centre then gets them their immigration status sorted, benefits and housing. And more recently, what we've been doing is getting them criminal injuries compensation. So that's great. And it's really dire. The stories are harrowing, really harrowing. But what is amazing is the women who've got babies, you kind of think, well, it must be a really strange relationship with the child because it's, from this terrible experience. But all of them, and it shows the resilience of women, say it's the only good thing that came out of it. And it's a wonderful thing. And it's really inspiring. And those women are so strong, I can't tell you. It's amazing. It just is so uplifting. You could feel like, how terrible is this? So you've got them. Then you've got women who are asylum seekers. And the asylum seeker women, it could be that they've been political activists in trade unions or academics or whatever. And that's why they're fleeing persecution, help to get them asylum. But then there's also the women who, because of sexuality, because they're lesbian or trans women, and then they'll be forced into marriages and whatever. So deal with those as well. So that's that category. But then you've got all the other women, the normal domestic violence. So these are the women who come through the door, and they might come for something else, and they don't tell you initially. They come for some other issue or whatever, and then as they get to trust you, it will come out, their violence. And several cases we've had of women who've been locked in their house and they're only allowed to come out to pick up the children from school. And there's a whole range of issues that keep them there. So there's the fear, the shame, but also the economic dependence. So, you'll often hear there's not enough refugees, so women can't leave. Well, why does the woman have to leave her house? Why isn't it that the man is forced to leave the house and the woman remains in their home safe, and that the law protects them as it can do? And part of the reason it doesn't is because the cuts to legal aid, massive, terrible cuts to legal aid, back in 2013. But there's also another group of women who asylum seekers, you probably know that back in the old days, before 1997, if you're an asylum seeker woman, mainly they were all concentrated in London. I think it was 80% of asylum seekers were in London, and they were able to work and get housing themselves. And when we had a Labour government come in, what they did was to introduce the worst piece of legislation for asylum ever that I've known, that dispersed asylum seekers to northern towns and cities, and in places that they were not welcome, and they put them in danger there. So there's a whole range of things. So domestic violence is a high percentage of the cases we deal with across a different groups, really. And then you get the girls, women, girls who are victims of child abuse within the family, that it's covered up. I mean, it's really horrendous, and I just don't think people realise the extent, and also that it happens. If I talk about people being trafficked in Harrow, people think, in Harrow, no, that can't be right. Can't be. It must be some other place this happens, but it's not. It's on all our doorsteps. Behind hidden doors.
Yeah. And Alison, you've obviously spent a large part of your life in doing work in the global trade union federations and working with women kind of internationally and unions that represent, working women globally. And what kind of factor is violence in their lives as well? I mean, how does that kind of play out on an international level?
It's huge, and it's huge. I think it's something like 70% of the world's poor and working poor are women. So that, in a sense, encapsulates the fact that women are at risk both in the workplace, at home, and in their communities from some form of violence. And it doesn't have to be domestic violence, but it can be, FGM. It can be, as Pam's pointed out, trafficking. It can be rape, of course, which isn't dealt with seriously in the UK, never mind if you're in a global south economy. And it was a struggle at first, I would say, to get unions. And I did work in the transport system in a global federation. I now work independently. But initially it was a struggle to get our unions, even in the US and Europe, so-called more, advanced economy unions, to take the issue of domestic violence and workplace seriously, because they would say it's a social issue. So it's something outside the workplace. So we shouldn't, not we shouldn't, but we've got too much else on our agendas. We just can't deal with that. No. And it was the women themselves that repeatedly came back and said, and you do a survey, and I travel around and we work with men and women unions on the ground, and you'd say, well, okay, what are your top 3 issues, or what's affecting you? And workplace violence and violence at home came back time and time and time again. Now, particularly in transport, because of course women on the buses or the trains, and again, it's about segregated labour, because the women are the cleaners, the ticket sellers, the food sellers. So they're going to they'll have more direct contact with passengers and the community than the brothers who are the drivers, the engineers, the technicians, whatever. And what really highlighted it, I think for me more than many of the other cases, and again, sisters would give their stories, we would put pressure on unions to take action against an employer. But what really struck us was a union in Mahabharatna in the Indian state, where the women on there's a local bus federation, state federation, ran the buses. And the women on those buses, again, were the cleaners, the ticket sellers, etc. But about 8 years ago, 2 of the women had burnt themselves to death because of what was happening to them. Now, obviously, that's an extreme example. But I think that sort of case brought it home in a way to our unions, where more than almost anything else graphically. And what had happened was a wonderful woman who'd worked on the buses, found the ITF office in Mumbai, came along, talked to the office. We've only got 2 people. It's an old railway shed, so, you know, it's not posted. And came along and spoke and said, look, you know, what can I do? What can I do? Hardly spoke English. She learned English in 3 months to deal with this issue. It was just one of the things she did. And we talked to the union and began to support them in training, and we helped with an organiser, etc. And again, what was interesting was some of the brothers, and of course some of the men in the union are the harassers, so there has to be a whole workplace training piece of work done. And so there was a bit of reluctance at first to, yeah, that's great, you can send an organiser and you can pay for, in fact, it was Sheila who had first come to the ITF, we paid for us, and that's great, but it's almost nothing to do with us. So it was a lot of education and development and challenge, actually, which again is difficult if you're coming in as the European, I mean, but that's another discussion. But what happened was the women had training, had some development, education work, and began to organise. And we got a woman onto the executive, and now the union is trying to establish women's committees in each of the bus stations. Now, obviously, COVID has had an impact on that. But again, this is about experience, isn't it? Experiential. You do it, women are doing it on the ground. And that campaign and that building of union power of women was, I would argue, probably one of the most effective reasons or campaigns as to why an international transport federation, where the minority of its members are women workers, actually began to understand that violence is a trade union issue, both in the workplace, but obviously also in our communities. There's a lot more we can be done, but that really, and there's other examples we can use. Yeah. But again, that came from, and you can't emphasise, which is when we look at any form of union work, it seems to me, building unions or whatever, of course, it's the ground, it comes from the ground and the experience of workers themselves. That makes them move. All the best education programs I've done, that's all very good, but it's the conditions on the ground.
Yeah. And I remember, I mean, I think one of my favourite Ken Loach films is The Bread and Roses, you know, and that tells the story of the LA janitors strike, and huge numbers of women involved in that. You know, it's really interesting. I mean, it's a real life scenario. But one of the things that was interesting was when was how much sexual kind of violence was used against women who were organising. So it was a weapon as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. It is a weapon. Yeah. And again, we have to be vigilant, and we have to, again, you know, train our union organisers, train our union reps and our brothers to be aware of that, because of course for many, and especially if you are in, you know, a poorer economy, well, for all of us, also in the UK at the moment, feeding yourself, feeding your kids, getting yourself to work, of course, are major challenges. But if you're in a poor economy where you're an informal worker and you're selling food or you're distributing bus tickets or whatever, the awareness is just not going to be as present. On one level, on another level, it's absolutely present because it is those workers' lives. And they understand it. It's a weapon that employers or people in power will use, be they men or women. I mean, obviously, there's a whole, which again, we won't have time to discuss tonight, around how emotional violence and, you know, all the mental health aspects of bullying and can be, but not tonight. That's another longer discussion, I think.
That's really interesting, Alison. You know, Pam, obviously Alison's touched on quite a few things there in terms of kind of turning the situation round. But I just wanted you to get, if you could kind of like summarise like what you think the socialist response to this kind of violence against women should be, and what are the demands that we should be making as a movement in response to it?
I mean, to sort of end violence against women, you have to really end inequality, don't you? And that is so hard to do. But we were moving towards some of that with the manifestos of 2019 and 2017. So if you think of just about the immediate thing, like women not having access to legal aid when they've got a violent partner to get out of a relationship, so they're stuck with them, that's an immediate thing that could happen overnight. The issues around housing, if you're stuck in a property that you can't move out because you can't afford to, you're stuck in a workplace where you've got an abusive boss or whatever, all of those things. But I have to say also, the women who try to change things are often the ones who are most attacked, and it's usually working class women. So there's this whole kind of, within the kind of feminist movement, if you like, that keeps women down. So you've got, you know, if you think about what happened in 1997, we had the awful term Blair's Babes or whatever it was, where we had all these women coming into Parliament, and you'd be really optimistic and think things are going to change. And one of the first things they did was to cut benefits for single parents, which primarily affects women. So you need those structural changes, but you need to change the attitudes in society as well. And how do we get to that without, if you think about it, if you've got a capitalist society, everybody becomes a commodity, and women are at the bottom of that, aren't they? And the kind of most stark example is that we've been talking about, of women being sold for prostitution, trafficked, you know, having no rights at all. There's different degrees of that and how people are beholden. So if you think about the whole kind of credit thing that we're in, that people are tied up with credit cards, not enough money to pay their bills, we hardly have time for demonstrating. You know, how can a working class woman organise now when she's working 3 jobs just to pay the rent, and she's got choices between eating and heating? So you've got to deal with the economic side of it to give women the freedom to be able to organise, because otherwise what you get, and it's personified to me by International Women's Day, which I keep on about, that they've got a website and they give us an official theme every year for International Women's Day. It's so removed from any reality of how this all started, of working class women, trade unions fighting for their rights. Now, on the other hand, I think because of the situation we're in, and we saw it yesterday, women are angry. They've been at the brunt of COVID. They've been at the brunt of austerity measures for 10 years. So I think we will see a radicalisation of women demanding rights. But it really is, you know, if you improve the rights of women, you improve the rights of everybody, don't you? So it affects everybody. So it's structural changes, how we get there with such a government and a Labour Party that's just failing, not only women, but all working class people, really. But the concrete things, decent benefit system, decent wages for people, minimum pay, decent employment rights so you can't be sacked, end to 0 hours contracts, legal aid restored, all of those things would give so much more power to women and can be done. We do have the money. Look how much we've just wasted on all the Tories' mates, but they choose, it's a political choice. But I think they've gone too far. I think people will start to rebel. And we have to take it. It's the only way we're going to get it. Nobody's going to come up with a book that tells us how to gain equality for women or how to stop violence against women, no matter what Fabian Women or anybody else says. You know, we've got to do it for ourselves and take control of that. And that's clearer to me than ever. The older I get, the more radical I get, because nothing ever changes. And I'm sick of it. And I'm sure there's lots of other people like me. I never, you know, I mean, anyway, it's just ridiculous. But I have to say, women who do put their head above the parapet, and I know this from being a parliamentary candidate, particularly if you're not from the right class, from the right background, you get attacked if you don't play the game. And we saw that with Laura on Tuesday. There was a class element to that. You know, the language that was used, you're getting above yourself, questioning me. And thank God she does. Thank God we've got people like Laura around. And, you know, that goes into the issue about solidarity amongst women. You know, I think some of us in recent weeks haven't seen much solidarity amongst some sisters. So where is that? You know, it's one thing to sign a petition. There's one thing to hold up a placard with some silly slogan. It's one thing to even go down to a demonstration. But what about when you're really tested? When you're tested, what do? Do you stand alongside people and be brave, even when it's hard to do so? So a long-winded explanation. I don't have an answer, but we're there. We'll get there in the end, I suspect, through struggle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Alison, did you have anything to add to that kind of?
Well, just coming on violence, I think the UN has called it the silent pandemic. We're looking at the death rate and the attacks on women globally. And the other, of course, women in the present climate, the present economic climate, they're far worse. They're far more disadvantaged because of the loss of jobs in retail, in cleaning, etc. So they're frontline workers. In fact, and again, that's the double exploitation, isn't it? Because I mean, women at birth, we know what we are. We're carers, we're producers of labour, we're cleaners, we're health workers, we're all rolled into one, which is great. We're multi-skilled, we're multi-talented. However, what that also means is that there is not enough access to so-called skill training or STEM type education or STEM jobs. But of course, a change in a Labour government to a Labour government is not going to fundamentally affect that. We don't control the corporations who employ the labour force, who employ women, who keep women in marginalised roles. And just to echo, I mean, again, when I went to school, I did A-level economics. And I remember a male teacher saying to me, which to me, again, always sums up, he said, "Why are you doing that?" I said, And he said, well, you're going to get married soon, aren't you? And he really summed it up because, of course, most of the girls I went to school with in the grammar school, and I was lucky, I passed my 11 plus because the Labour government had got me a grant to stay on. But again, because most of the girls, if you stayed on to the sixth form, you did teacher training, or you stayed on to the lower sixth and you did shorthand and typing. And most of the girls and the boys left again, at that stage, you could leave at 15 and went into factories and offices. They didn't get any higher education or advanced education at all. So the idea that now women are being even denied access to basic jobs, decent jobs, that we thought we had won in the last, 30 years. But of course, the global economy doesn't need us. The UK economy doesn't need us. What it wants us is that, reserve army of labour. We always talk about it. So we can continue to be the cleaners and the cooks and the rest of it. And I think, but I also am optimistic, which is where we started this discussion, that there will be uprisings, that women will not take it, women workers, and women stuck at home, and women having to give up jobs because, oh my God, they're trying to do homeschooling as well as all the other tasks. And when I say this, I'm not in any way, being negative about men and the roles that they play. I mean, we know this is part of the society, the system that we've all been born and brought up in. But I think there will be challenges from women. I mean, you already see it in the way that, looking at my constituency and all the women I know, my sister and my sisters run food banks. My sisters are engaged in mutual aid. And those women and the women who are actually starving, I mean, let's be honest, we talk about, this really makes me angry because we talk about all the terrible effects of COVID. But actually, it's women and children who are suffering, who are dying, who are starving, and it's as sharp as that. And once some of the, once some of the restrictions are more relaxed, I think we will see women coming out and women demanding not just access to decent jobs, but access to basic services. And it'd be interesting to see what Labour's response to that is. Because I think I'm just going to finish on one of the weaknesses of our 2019 and 2017 policies, and Jeremy probably won't agree with me on this, is I don't think our policies around family, around women's education, about women's rights, about women's employment rights were anywhere near strong enough or thought through. I'm not saying that good MPs didn't battle, but I don't think they were sharp enough or high enough actually on the list in the for a new Labour government to implement. So I probably rambled a bit, but
Alison, I actually wanted to push you a bit further on because you've talked an awful lot there about class issues, really, haven't you? And
Yeah.
I know your kind of political tradition has always emphasised those issues around class. I mean, violence against women happens at all levels of society,
Yeah.
but there's a particular issue around class, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, because, and again, I can relate it to myself and I can relate it to sisters I've worked with and sisters I know, is that one of the reasons we stayed in a domestic violence situation was because there wasn't anywhere else to go. You couldn't walk out of the house. If there were, and now, of course, we've seen there are no refuges hardly. They've all been cut to the bone. So for a woman, whether she's at home or whether she's working outside the home and stuck at home, a working class woman, how can she afford to find somewhere else, escape? She's not going to have the material resources. She's not going to have the access, as I said earlier, to STEM type jobs or whatever else label. Our communities, and when you look at Islington, it's meant to be this very rich, wealthy borough, etc. It's the fourth most deprived borough in the country. And what does that mean for working class women? It means that food banks, low paid jobs, no access to childcare. Schools will try their hardest, but they cannot compensate for lack of basic computers at home or lack of being fed at home, nutrition. They try their best in Islington. It's a very progressive council. But it is fundamentally about working class women who cannot access support services, even if they're available, and who bear that double brunt of having to manage the home, bring up the kids. I can't remember what the figures are for single parent families. Again, it's the majority of single parent families who experience homelessness, who experience they're working class predominantly. And it is a class issue, and which is not to deny support for any sister who's had, been brutalised or whatever. But it's inbuilt in our system, isn't it? We are.
I just come in there because loads of women that I've dealt with have been considering returning to their abusive partner because it's so difficult to leave. And then it's even more dangerous for them, because if you think what it means, if you're in a low paid job, how do you afford any other accommodation? It's impossible. In Harrow, we've got hardly any council homes. So everybody who's poor relies on the private sector. So we've also got high levels of low pay. So how do you set up a household with kids yourself and pay for it? So the level of housing costs is prohibitive. So people do think about returning, but also when they apply for benefit, they say it's the first time they've left a partner who's been working, and they apply for universal credit, and you've got a 6-week wait at least before you get your first payment. The social fund has been abolished, so people can't get help with beds and bedding and all the rest of it. They've got to go to their local authority. There's no clear information about it. And there's all the stigma and the problems. Do you want to move out of borough because you want to get away from abusive partner? Often in Harrow and other London boroughs, what they do is now, if you move, if you go to the council and say you need housing because of domestic violence, you'll be placed far out of London. So all the support network that a woman's got of her family or extended family, she's lost that. And she's gone to an area that she knows nobody, so she'll come back. And it's the system, you can see, what the problems are. But the other thing that comes up, not directly related to women, but impacting on women so much, this moving around from borough to borough of temporary housing, is that they're finding that their kids, and this really impacts on Black families, are moving from borough to borough, and the kids are the new kids in the borough, and they get picked on. And we've had several murders because of that, that they are then seen to be coming into somebody else's territory, and it's had a real impact on women losing their sons and being really worried about what's happening to their children. It's a dire situation we're in for women, really, on so many levels. It's got to change. That's why, like you, Alison, I'm optimistic. We can't put up with this for much more. They've pushed us too far, and they were lucky. Terrible thing to say with COVID, it's covered up quite a lot because we've had to keep at home. We've not been able to go out on the streets and protest, but that day is going to come very soon.
Yeah. And Pam, you mentioned one or two things about kind of the feminist movement and solidarity and so on. I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about that, and particularly about the Labour Party, and something that I talked to Laura Pidcock about quite a lot when I worked for her as well, about it feels a little bit like there's not a space for, organisationally, I mean, for working class women within the Labour Party, and that's I mean, is that true? Is it been, is it just that it's been, organised in places we can't see, or is that a real major problem within the party?
I think it's a major problem. I think it's been a problem for a long time, not just a new one. And I was thinking back, so I used to be involved with the Women's Budget Group, which is kind of tries to influence policymakers to have gender budgets. And we were involved in a project with women in poverty that spanned about 2 years. And what we did was bring women together and had kind of political education for them around a whole range of things, and then enabling them to have the confidence to speak. And it culminated in an event in Parliament with mainly Labour politicians, peers and MPs. This was back, I think it was when Labour was still in power, 2008 or something. And the way that some of the MPs, the women, spoke to the women in poverty who came up with really good ideas. They came up with the idea of an Equality Act because that's what they needed to make their lives better. And they came up with wonderful ideas, but it was giving that opportunity and not just dumping somebody. So if you think a working class woman comes along to a Labour CLP meeting and tries to raise something, not knowing the rules, the procedures, the policy, the objections, all the rest of it, you get shouted down. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've been shouted at my CLP meeting, but then you lose confidence to do things. So you've got to kind of build up that confidence. And I think I found my political voice by representing other women mainly who were poor within my job. And then you get to see that it's much wider than the individual thing. So gradually your kind of understanding of what's going on grows. And that's what we need to do. When I left school, I didn't know all these organisations that were behind the scenes doing everything. I wasn't involved in student politics. I didn't go to university until I was much older. That's the norm for most working class people. It's not, straight from school to Oxford, Bristol, do PPE or whatever, and then, go and work for an MP or something. So we need to understand where people are at and what's important to them and learn the language to talk to ordinary people and bring them with us. And then you do get movement. So, I mean, I was a trade union rep in a workplace for a long time. And again, that's where you politicise people because you're focusing on a common aim, which is usually around, they're trying to cut your terms and conditions or you want better terms. And you focus on that and you get people working collectively and then they can see what you can achieve. So I always used to get people saying to me, oh, why should I join the union? What's the union ever done for me? And I'd always say, it's not what the union can do for you, it's what we as a union can do. But then they saw that because we achieved things, we got better pay when they were trying to cut jobs, and the voluntary sector is notorious, all these organisations that go on about anti-poverty. So when I set up the law centre in which I work, and when I set it up that we'd have pay parity. So I'm the director of the law centre and we have a range of jobs. We all get paid the same. I can't tell you how many socialist women struggle with that concept that we all get paid the same. What, you mean the admin worker gets the same as you? Well, how does that work? What motivates you? Do you think, because I love my job, I love what I do, I'm really motivated by that. And we have a good team spirit because of that, because everybody feels invested and valued. And you kind of think, well, why does somebody who's got a job as an admin worker need less money than somebody who's a director? Really, it's the kind of same. And sometimes they need more. I'm lucky I own a house. I don't have to rent somewhere, but other people do. So it's kind of what you do in your day-to-day life, I think, and really live your socialist values. And there are lots of people who do that, but there's an awful lot of people who don't. And that's what we need to spot and get politicians who actually do what they say, and there were some good ones, but there's a lot of bad ones.
Absolutely.
Rambled on a bit there. I think I lost the thread of
no. And sadly, we know some of the less progressive, let's say, politicians. Yeah. What's really interested me was, the trade unions really are the backbone of the movement and of our party. There is no question, because they are the training ground in democracy, in collective organising to win, be it, access to a creche, be it paid maternity leave, equal pay, not having, your conditions destroyed. And through that organising, through, as you say, Pam, and it's, I know it's common and it's basic, but we don't talk about it enough. That grand organising, working together, and I will say actually it's something in my CLP, but I'll part that for a minute, is like that's the training ground in democracy. You come together, you play, you're delivering a campaign or you're fighting back against an employer. You work out what needs to be done. You work out what's possible to negotiate. You do the negotiation. Now, obviously, you might have one or two paid officials who'll help you, but they have to rely on your experience and understanding of the workplace and of what the real issues are. And that then raises the question of, well, who are the leaders? How are they elected? How represent? Now, this is all basic stuff. We know this. But that, for me, is why the trade unions are the core and why we should actually be embracing the newer unions that are not formally in the TUC to work with us in the party and in the movement, because some of those smaller unions are representing migrant workers. And I know they tend to be called the pop-up unions, as though they're going to pop up now and then disappear.
Pop away.
Pop away, probably. So because, let's be blunt, sometimes it happens. One union organises a bit of a sector and then another union comes in on the back and, we don't do poaching, do we? No. Okay. But that in itself, but the election of your steward, the accountability of your steward. And I wish we had more officers within, in the formal job roles in the trade union movement who were accountable in that way. But that's the ABC. And I remember, because we're a big constituency, I think we still got 4,000 members. We had nearly 5,000. And I'm being parochial, but we've got an EC of around 30. We had 28 comrades last Monday night. And I have to say, the commitment, not just to socialism and to the policies that we tried to win on in the last elections, but to doing the work, mutual aid, the Holloway housing campaign, the trade union work. They are activists first and foremost within the community. They're not, some, I want to be a Labour MP or I want to be a Labour councillor, and you can forget the rest of it. So I think, and just to finish, I just finished on it. Our secretary, we had, it's just actually stood down a brilliant secretary in my CLP. Now, he used to vote Tory until the 1980s. He probably won't. He worked for the Daily Mail. He's lovely. But he came in and he's now become this brilliant radical Marxist, all the rest of it. In the short space. I think the defeat taught him more than anything, actually. Again, experience. And he went to Labour Party conference. And he said, all these working class people. Because he's working class lad from Bradford originally. He said, where have they come from? This is brilliant. Trade unions, And it was that, yes, the working class not just has the power, but actually knows how to organise and knows how to win. So I think we have to keep reinforcing that. And just on women in the party, I think we've got a very good women's section. However, we've got, for example, a whole group of amazing Somali women from one of the estates or two. And they go out, partly because we've got a really good women's officer who, they go out on the elections and they get people to vote Jeremy or vote Labour or whatever. They do the groundwork, a lot of it. But are they members of the party? Do they come along to CLP? No, of course not. They're too busy. If they've got jobs, they're going to be poorly paid casual jobs, but they're too busy managing their families and their estate and all the rest of it. And we've got to find a way. And, I would say, look, we don't have to, they don't have to be paid up members. And if they need to be, we'll find a way of supporting that. It should be £1, wouldn't it, a month or something? Or not even that, £1 a year for sisters like that. But let's bring them in. And we started to try and discuss with those sisters, and again, thanks to our youth officer, about their issues where they are, and mobilise and support them more. And actually, that sounds patronising, actually, they don't need necessarily our support and mobilising, but for a political voice, to have them more active in the party would be I mean, I think could really transform some of our wards in North Islington. However, we're a long way from that. So yeah, I mean that, and just one more thing, and I will finish on Islington Council. Like some other councils, a very progressive policy in the sense of 50% of our councillors are women, and the way shortlists are managed, that's kept to solidly. And of course, the discussion often is, well, that's great, but how? And I don't just mean Islington, because we actually do have a number of councillors who come from our local communities, different faiths, different races. But so what's in some boroughs? So what? You've got 50% women. What does that mean? How representative are those women? What are their life experiences? What are their workplace experiences? And of course, that in a sense takes us back to Blair Babes, doesn't it? So yeah, I don't hold any animosity towards the sisters. However, the key leaders, the key workers are people who come from our background and our experience, and they actually run the economy and run society. So they make sure it's delivered. So basics in it.
Brilliant, Alison. We're actually kind of we're past the hour,
Right.
Which is not surprising, because I honestly could sit and listen to you both all night, and I think I know, I honestly have to say I've learned so much from both of you throughout the last kind of like few months as well, and but I just wanted to kind of like, in a way, kind of sum up and try and kind of tie up some loose ends. So I just wanted to ask Pam, what do you think in terms of priorities for socialist feminists going forward? You know, how should women be organising in the unions, in communities like Alison just described there, but also in the party? What are the kind of like key principles of that?
From my recent experience, I think the key thing is socialism. It really is. Not identity, not whether you're a woman, it is socialism, because that will benefit us all. So if we have good political education about what socialism means, what collective kind of action, what solidarity means. And I know that sounds odd, because doesn't everybody know that? But I don't think everybody does get that. So how do we ensure that? Because then you can't win. We know that as trade unionists do. If you've got a split kind of group in a workplace within the union, that's what management have always done, divide and rule. If they can do that, if you can pick people off, you don't win. So the first thing is having that solidarity. Unless we build that solidarity, we can't go forward. And that solidarity with all our comrades, you know. So you start then to build on it. And then within the Labour Party, to think about it is soul destroying. I mean, I'm so kind of jealous of Alison, because she even manages in Islington North to convert Daily Mail employees to be Marxists. I mean, you know, come on, that's really unfair.
No, events, comrade, nothing to do personal. Events.
I've no hope of that in Harrow, I can tell you. But so it can be really demoralising organising within the Labour Party, within the CLP. So we have to support each other as socialists. And I think, and one idea, not just that I've been saying, but lots of people have been saying, is about a left conference, that we bring people together. Yeah. So we see ordinary working class people with all their diversity, with all their ideas, with all their experience of organising. And then we agree how the way forward. Because what we've got too much at the moment, the last year has been dreadful, with left kind of sometimes just having slanging matches in public, and we can't have that, because we are never going to win anything. So, you know, we're talking about women, but it goes across the board with, you know, throughout the movement. And we've got too many people who've come in and have tried to destroy that. You know, we have so often the kind of middle class women who use our history, they clothe themselves in our experiences, and they work with us, they work with the working class, but then when they get into power, they abandon us, and they enjoy their privilege. So we can't have that. So we have to be careful about who we select for positions. They've got to be genuine socialists, not fake socialists, not people who are going to turn on their sisters or any of their comrades. That you have your arguments respectfully, like we do in trade unions usually, and then you don't fall out about it. You move forward collectively. And we should take a lesson from the right in that. I hate to take any lessons from the right, but they are solid in their unity, aren't they? They are ruthless in it. And
it's easier.
It's easier. They're after one thing. So I think, there's no mystery to it. I think we need to build that solidarity, get an understanding of what that means. We have to get rid of the egos in our movement who are causing more damage than anything else, and have a common approach to it. And then perhaps a left conference, but building within the trade union. So taking up positions within the trade unions, becoming shop stewards, getting involved in the wider movement.
Yeah. Anything to add to that, Alison, in terms of...
The first thing really is listening to our party members, going out and listening to, and we don't do that, it seems. A lot, the defeats, in fact, it almost seems to have crystallized into mantra speaking or trotting out platitudes. Where is the thinking? Where is the reflection? Where is the understanding? Where is the debate? Where is history? Where do we hear from the experiences of our members and our communities? And I count myself in this because so many of us are involved in small left groupings or small groupings in trade unions. And if we're not careful, we end up talking to each other and citing some 1989 split or something. And actually, not only are we not building, but we lose out. The one thing the trade union workers taught me is I learned so much, I gained so much. And we miss out by not listening, by not understanding. And it's heartbreaking. I sound very emotional about it, but I do feel emotional about it, because that is the only way. Once we start to listen and we share our learning and our experiences, basic education, the Labour Party seems to have forgotten about Labour movement education. Never mind debating the Green New Deal, which actually I thought our policy wasn't sharp enough on eco-socialism. But again, that's another debate. But we need those debates. We need those discussions. We need to take people forward. But it has to be rooted in our communities, the workplace, what we're doing every day. Otherwise, it's meaningless. And I'm optimistic about the class. I'm optimistic that there will be movement and uprising. My concern at the moment, which is why possibly a conference might help, is yet again, how will that be led? How will that actually, and that's not to say there aren't brilliant workplace leaders and leaders on the ground and leaders throughout the movement, but how will that be taken forward? And I'm a bit worried at the minute there isn't any sort of team around or working together across the left, warts and all, who is doing that or even wants to do it, which is, and I'm as good at anyone, and I will finish on that, and having a left argument with someone else about popular frontism in the 19th. So what? That is not useful. Well, bits of it are in the here and now.
There's definitely a vacuum in terms of leadership, huge. I think. Yeah, huge.
Yeah.
And a lack of listening. And I feel like, Ben, I've learned a lot today, and I love listening to you, Alison, because you've done so much. And there's so many people like that in our party, that when you talk to them and you hear the things that they've been through, and they know they've been, it's nothing new really. We've been through all these struggles before. So nobody's going to come up with a magic solution. It's just going to be hard work on the ground.
Yeah. And I remember, a couple of years ago, we did a kind of festival around the Durham Miners Gala, and we one of the sessions that I ran with Liam Young, I talked about the generational kind of split that was emerging on the left, and I said I was really worried about it, because we're in danger of losing, the energy of young people and being able to organise and and potentially that potential, but then on the other hand the experience, and I talked about all this kind of language of cranks and all that sort of stuff, and how negative that was, and how that would sow the seeds of division. I can't say that has particularly changed really, and it's a real worry. But but I'm so glad that you two have come on tonight, because I think it kind of illustrates the value of that experience and listening to people like you. And I honestly, I mean, I'm not exaggerating. I can sit here for another 2 hours and listen to all this, but we do have some sort of discipline in terms of the schedule and everything, and so I'm gonna sort of draw this to a close. Thank you so much for the discussion. I think it's been a really interesting session, and hugely valuable things have come out of it, I think. I just want to mention that Pam is actually standing for the Women's Committee for Labour Women's Conference, which is coming up. So if you have she's part of the Grassroots Labour Women's Slate, and if you have a CLP meeting coming up where you can nominate her, please do it, because she's just a magnificent comrade. She really is. So, and I think she would represent women so well on there. And you can tell that from what she said today. So, but thank you so much, both of you. And
thank you.
I think we might have you on again, if that's all right.
Can I just say also about Pam, invited to your CLPs, to your wards, to your activities, both on Zooms, sadly, and in bodily form.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to do that. Okay. One of the benefits of Zoom, I can travel around the UK quite easily.
Absolutely.
So that's easy. No, thank you, Ben. It's brilliant. Thank you. It's been lovely.
Thanks, you didn't get a word in, Ben. We didn't listen enough. Bye.
I'm happy with that. I'm happy.